As a content strategist, you need to show your peers, your boss, your clients how effective your work is. As a content professional, you want to be as smart as you can about how you plan and create content. And as a manager, you want to build a content operation that integrates content strategy into your organization. Colleen Jones has some great insights into all of these challenges. We talk in this episode about content effectiveness, content intelligence, and content operations.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 47 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really delighted today to have with us Colleen Jones. Colleen she does a lot of stuff. So she's the CEO of Content Science, which is a content intelligence and strategy company. She's the founder of Content WRX, which is a content effectiveness software company. She publishes the Content Science Review, which is an online content strategy magazine. She wrote about 9 or 10 years ago, Clout, the art and science of influential web content. And she recently updated that book. It's now called The Content Advantage: The Science of Succeeding at Digital Business Through Effective Content. Did I miss anything, Colleen? Tell me what you're up to these days.
Yeah, you are spot on. And what, in addition, I'm doing these days is really opening up consulting and professional services through Content Science. Again, I took a brief hiatus from that while I was reading content at MailChimp for about 9 months. And I'm really excited to get going on helping lots of other different types of companies and organizations in a more hands-on way. And everything that you mentioned, Content Science Review, Content Works, our online academy, Content Science Academy, all of that is still going strong as well. So lots of fun stuff happening.
So never a dull moment. So there's a few things. There's a lot that I would love to talk with you about. But we talked before. I want to make sure we get to at least three kind of a top level look at three of the key concepts that I think you've really worked over in your book and in your work. This notion, when first is like the notion of content effectiveness. I think that's of real interest to a lot of people. There's a statistic I've seen several times now that only a third of people measure their content effectiveness. A third of companies measure their content effectiveness. And it just seems like, wow, we should all be better at that and better at understanding it. So can you tell me a little bit about how you conceive of content effectiveness and how you come to some conclusions about whether content is working or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I developed this notion with the content science team after seeing time after time kind of the reality of that stat you just mentioned, seeing companies and content teams either not evaluate content at all or really struggle and become delayed and really slowed down by trying to come up with some way to assess or evaluate content on an ongoing basis. And so I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to share it in the Content Advantage because, it's something that we developed after I published Clout, the first edition of the book. And it's a really solid approach because there's a lot of data behind it, just our data collection and working with lots of different companies, and then a lot of experience, not just my experience, but, experience of other people that had the pleasure coming across and working with over the years. And so I came up with this notion of content effectiveness to delineate the space between two other spaces. One space is, content volume and quality. So how much content are you putting out? What's the level of quality? Is it meeting certain standards like legal compliance or accessibility compliance or other kinds of standards that it might have to meet? And that's all important. I find a lot of content teams measure that in some way because it's easy or because they have to. But it doesn't really tell you whether the content made a difference to customers or users or to the business. And then this content effectiveness space also is different than things like content ROI or broader ROI of the product or the marketing that the content is a part of, or even, the support, if the content is really focused on support. So it's really hard to, I think, get a really accurate understanding of things like ROI if you aren't measuring content effectiveness in any way, if you aren't really understanding the effectiveness and impact. And I think because it's been challenging for companies and organizations, especially with content teams within them, to assess content effectiveness, they're really missing out on telling some great stories about the impact of their content. And so content effectiveness is essentially a framework of 6 dimensions. And I've found that these dimensions work broadly across different companies and organizations and different contexts like marketing and product experience and support. It's a framework of dimensions really intended to help someone get started with this quickly. And, a particular company or organization can always tweak them or adjust them to, fit what makes sense for what they're trying to accomplish. But it's a lot faster usually to tweak something existing than to try and come up with it from scratch. And then, really wanted to have an offer and share, something credible that a lot of people could draw upon and get buy-in to a bit more quickly than just having to try and come up with something from scratch as well. And so those 6 dimensions are, I'll just mention each of them super quickly, are discoverability or findability of content. This is all about whether the content is easy for customers or users to actually find and consume. Another dimension is polish, whether the customers or users perceive the content format and the style as appropriate for the experience or the channel or the touch point. And just a quick comment there broadly, most companies and organizations do this pretty well, get their content to a certain level of polish. And yeah, it seems to be something that they probably spend, too much time worrying about. And there are a lot of other areas of content effectiveness where I think they could get more bang for their buck.
Got it.
So, and then the other areas are accuracy, which is all about whether customers perceive the content as correct, current, up to date. And notice I say perceive there,
Right.
because, even if it's actually up to date, but there's some question in the customer's mind for some reason, which is something I've seen quite a lot, it might as well not be accurate because it's going to undermine the trust that customers and users have in it. Then two other dimensions of content effectiveness are usefulness and relevance. And this might sound similar, and they do go hand in hand, but they're distinct. Something that I see quite a lot is content that appears to be useful. It's in the right kind of approach. It's got really chunked, very scannable content. It's got a good style or voice, but it's not actually pertinent to the specific questions and needs that the customer is trying to use the content are experiencing. It's not relevant. And if I had a penny for every time I've seen that, I would be quite rich.
Yeah. So all those things you just mentioned, I'm just curious, like I know at ContentWorks, you've done like research to show, that you can, that you've shown how, with research, that how well content is meeting these marks. But I'm curious, a lot of people, we're all notoriously overworked in this profession. And are there any, like, not shortcuts, but heuristics or ways to tighten up? Like when you were talking about polish, we all, like people who come from an editorial background, kind of know it when they see it. You kind of know when the content is ready to go. But I'm just wondering if there are ways short of a full-blown research team to measure content effectiveness, like kind of basic criteria you can apply to each of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So with, I'll just call out a couple different ones, and happy to cover others or dig into more wherever you would like. But I'll talk a little bit more about usefulness and relevant. So we've dug into this quite a lot because I think this is probably the biggest opportunity from a strategy standpoint for a lot of companies and organizations. So something that I see a lot is covering the same topics for the same types of people at the same level of sophistication over and over and over and over again, and not coming up with something that's more substantive, more specific to key customer segments or to customers in particular use cases or context where the content can really be very, very relevant and useful. And so, rule of thumb, based on what I've been seeing, is the more specific, the more terrific. Think about how you can cover the topics or needs that your customers or users have in a compelling way, a more sophisticated way, a deeper way, a way that's more relevant to the specific context that you already know about. And that doesn't necessarily have to take a bunch of research, just takes some empathy, some, putting yourself in the shoes of your customers and, having getting the support to cover something that's a little bit different than what others are covering, or the way that they're covering it, doing something that's similar to what a competitor is doing or to what others are doing feels safe and sometimes can be a little bit easier to get support for. But, that just isn't going to be a super effective strategy. And so some industries where, I see this a lot are, the financial space, covering the same kinds of tips and guidance and, insight around personal finances, other types of finances. Surely there are other ways of meeting the needs, or meeting new needs, meeting deeper needs, meeting more detailed, sophisticated kinds of questions, be it in the technology space as well, a lot in, other types of industries where offering education as part of the content strategy is key. So,
Yeah, a lot of what you're just talking about there. Yeah, a lot of what you said about that you don't necessarily need research to make those decisions, but it seems like, just a little imagination and a little empathy can go a long ways. And then, but then after the fact, you can go like, oh, wow, that was a worthwhile experiment. We're getting a lot better traction with that piece of content than with the boring old same thing about how to run a budget. Yeah,
exactly. Absolutely. And, you might not have the luxury of lots of in-depth qualitative research before you launch every single piece of content, but it is, easier and faster than ever now to get some kind of data about the impact of your content after it's out there in the world, and that we can really take advantage of to kind of validate the imagination, as you said, and ideas and theories that we've developed based on the empathy we have for customers and users really are spot on. And we can learn quickly if they're not.
Right.
And move on to the next idea.
That kind of gets to the next idea I wanted to talk to you about, which is this notion of content intelligence. I love that phrase. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at right there, right? This notion of from effectiveness to intelligence. Tell me about the difference between those two ideas, between content effectiveness and content intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. So content effectiveness is a framework to kind of help us do a variety of different things. Plan content that will be effective. It's a framework that can be useful in analysis and auditing to inform a content strategy. So you can look at the content you already have, as well as competitor content in that framework. Also look at it from other perspectives too. I'm not saying it's the only way to analyze and audit, but it's something that can be helpful as part of analyzing or auditing content as you develop the content strategy before you've put content out there. And then content effectiveness is a framework that can be one part of an overall system of content intelligence. And it can be a framework to help you decide what feedback from customers, as well as other, data you might want to focus on to understand whether your content is in fact findable or discoverable and useful and relevant and all of those good things. And content intelligence, I really think of as a system. It doesn't necessarily have to be fancy or sophisticated at first, but if you're planning from the outset to have some kind of content intelligence in place, you can really set yourself up for success. And I think of content intelligence as really broader than content effectiveness, and it's all about figuring out what data you can gain from the interactions people have with your content and their perspective on the content and the different ways you can use that data to inform your content strategy as well as inform other content related decisions you might make and beyond. So it's all about making the most of the fantastic data we can get from people interacting with our content.
Right. Hey, you're just reminding me of it. I love this analogy that you used in the book where you talk about the content intelligence. It's more like, I can't remember the exact context you brought it up in, but this is more like poker than chess. That like in chess, everything is known and out in public. Anybody who's watching the game can see what's going on. In poker, there's more strategy involved and more inference happening. Tell me a little bit about that and how that applies.
Yeah, absolutely. So to your point earlier, we don't have the luxury of conducting in-depth research with every bit of content that we produce and put out there. And so we are, as content strategists and other content professionals, constantly making decisions with partial information. And that is just the way it will always be. Mm-hmm. And so I was really struck by reading a book by Annie Duke, who is a poker champion, as well as a psychologist. She got as far as completing her PhD coursework and complete the dissertation. But she is a smart woman. And she made the observation in this book that, life is like poker because you're constantly making decisions with partial information. Life is not like chess because chess, there is always a clear way to win, no matter what point you are at in the game. There are only so many moves that can be made. And, after each move someone makes, the available options in terms of moves change. But there are always, a finite set of moves that you can make. There's always a way to win. With poker, you're dealing with partial information. And so a big advantage that you can gain with poker is to make decisions when you have the most available information. It's not going to be all the available information, but there are ways in poker that you can position yourself to, play a hand, make a decision at a time where you have more information than less. And so I was thinking about that in terms of content and, the idea that we are constantly forced to make decisions with partial information, but within that we can really make the most of the information or data in this case that we have. And, that's where content intelligence comes into play. And if we're smart and we really consciously collect data about the impact of our content, if we turn lessons learned into best practices for particular companies and organizations, if we use our data to learn not just about whether our content is effective, but also learn more about our customers and their preferences around content, their interests around content, and grow our ability to be more empathetic with them and put ourselves in their shoes even more easily. We really make everything about doing content well much easier. And we're not going to win every content effort that we put out there. Not every piece of content we put out to our customers and users is necessarily going to be exactly on point. But over time, more and more of the content that we put out there will be a fit for customers' our needs, will be effective, will help them accomplish the goals that they're trying to accomplish, which means that over time, our approach to content will be winning. It'll be really enabling our customers and users, and it will be achieving the goals that our business or organization have. And it's kind of a long play, the way poker is kind of a long game play, but it really does work. And as someone who's been in and around content for many, many years, the more I thought about the comparison between content and poker, the more I realized, wow, this really is quite a useful analogy. So that's where that came from.
That seems like an important one too, in terms of like communicating with, there's a lot of people seem to have the notion that like, well, everything is completely measurable now, completely knowable. And it's like, nah, it's still more like poker than chess. And, I think that's I'm going to steal that analogy. I think because I've had many conversations where that could have helped me. Hey, Colleen, I just noticed we're coming up on time. This always goes so fast. I always give my guests before we wrap up, is there anything that I haven't brought up or that hasn't come up in our conversation that about content strategy or content in general, or just anything that's on your mind that you'd like to share with our folks?
Yeah, I will just mention something briefly about another related area that benefits from thinking about content effectiveness and content intelligence, and that's content operations. And, with frameworks like content effectiveness and, system of content intelligence in place, or at least starting to think about getting that kind of system in place. Content operations, which is all the work of actually, getting the content done, actually making content strategy part of how a business does things, that becomes a lot easier as well, because you've got some frameworks that help speed up starting to evaluate content. You've got insights that you can draw upon that make decisions faster and easier. And I'm really excited about putting more time and attention around content operations, because it really makes or breaks the implementation of content strategy. And without solid content operations, content strategy is just a nice idea.
Right. No, and I love the way you just phrased that. You said something a second ago that it's not just about like getting the content through and done, but it's integrating content strategy as a part of your overall business practice. I think we'd all love to see that done more broadly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm really excited about making that happen. I think there's been a lot of progress over the past several years. And as content becomes even more important to businesses, as they become even more digital, we'll see even more progress. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity there.
Yep. Hey, can you give one quick success story there? Because I think people often grasp for examples because content ops is it's like a new thing, and is there anybody that you're aware of who's really doing it well, or?
Yeah. So content ops in a way is new, but in a way, to me, it's not, just because a lot of the work around the editorial side of content, like in journalism and media, as well as technical communication. There's a lot to draw upon from those areas. And I think that honestly, content is more conscious of and aware of and has more to draw upon in terms of operations than, say, design. And I know design ops is a thing that is valuable. I think it's a really good, interesting space. But, I think there's even more of a history behind and related to content around operations. And I think that, we should feel super confident and excited about that. In terms of examples, one interesting example is a large telecommunications company that I worked with, and I can't say the name, unfortunately, but large telecommunications company with multiple content related teams that had capabilities including content strategy, and they recognized a couple years ago that they needed to think about how they were structured as a team, what kinds of roles they had on their team, and they actually moved from having the majority of their teams be a few content strategists and mostly editors to having more content strategists, as well as shifting some writer editors into some specialized content roles like content analyst and content engineer. And the content engineer is really getting at kind of the architecture or structural side of content. And it was really tough, as you might imagine, with any large company organization getting change and momentum in place can be really tough. But they were able to do it through a combination of training, putting together a really solid case, and really tying the evolution of their content operations to changes that the business was making, significant changes. And it definitely took time, persistence. I'm not saying that it was, super smooth and happened overnight, but it happened. And I think that's a great example because it's very real, realistic. And, it's also very much about thinking of how you're going to sustain content strategy and implementation for the long term. It really does take thinking through the operations piece and the people, process, and technology around it.
Yeah, no, that's and I love one thing about that. Just that example is that I think we all kind of have ideas about like the roles that are emerging, and then in a big organization like that, they can be articulated very clearly. Like, oh yeah, we need a content analyst and we need a content engineer. But then I like, one of my big things these days is democratizing this whole profession and trying to make it accessible to everyone. So I think that even smaller organizations, I think it's going to benefit them to think like, oh yeah, we need to be thinking that I don't have a content engineer on the staff, but we need to think through that part of our operations. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, we're running out of time, Colleen. Thanks so much for coming on. This is great catching up with you. And I just got to tell everybody, just for folks in the Seattle area, Colleen's going to be here in Seattle next month. She's going to speak to the Content Strategy Meetup. So looking forward to meeting you in person there.
I am too, Larry. I can't thank you enough for inviting me to join your lovely podcast. Really enjoyed the chat, and I'm super excited to meet you in person next month and say hello to the wonderful folks in Seattle. We're going to have some fun.
It's going to be fun. You'll like our folks, and looking forward to having you out here. Well, thanks again, Colleen.
Thank you, Larry.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.